Welcome to Point Counterpoint, a mini-series for the Beirut Banyan podcast, co-hosted by Bashar Haidar and Michael Young. Bashar Haidar is a professor of philosophy at AUB. Michael Young is a senior editor at Carnegie's Middle East Center and the editor of Diwan, both voices offering unique perspective, nuanced disagreements, and debate over select subjects. And the first episode will dive into two topics. The first is the question of Western double standards, in particular honing in on the ongoing Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. The second topic is the question of criticism, particularly Hamas, during the ongoing war. There will be some reflection, some going back in time, but the mini-series will focus on the present. And in the meantime, if you enjoy it, share your comments, like the episode, engage our YouTube channel by subscribing, and if you're listening to this episode, follow us from your preferred podcast platform. And now, episode 1.
The question of is there a double standard for me is a no-brainer. Of course there is a double standard. There has always been a double standard and there will remain a double standard. With the Gaza conflict, this has been more evident. But I would just caution about saying across the board, it's a Western double standard. The fact of the matter is we've seen a big rift in the West between the elites. Let's take the case of the United States. Between the elites in the United States, in other words, the political elites, the defense elites, even to a certain extent, maybe the financial elites, and a generation of younger students. Now, are they a majority or not? This is a different question, but there has been a significant outbreak of protest among younger Americans, and who have not actually been on the side of the elites, who have said that what's taking place, as far as they're concerned, is a genocide in Gaza, and therefore they have to respond. This is how many young people have framed a little bit the discussion. So I'm not surprised today that there is a rift, and I'm not surprised that there are double standards. I had the pleasure of seeing Nikki Haley signing a 155 millimeter shell on the Israeli side of the Lebanese-Israeli border, saying, finish them. To be very honest, I don't think American officials generally would allow themselves such an obscenity, were the victims not from the Arab world. Maybe they would allow themselves to do this with Russians, but this kind of behavior can only be explained in the context of a double standard where you have effectively, and sorry to use what may sound like a cliche, but to a certain extent, you've mentally dehumanized the enemy that you want the Israelis to finish. And so definitely I'm not surprised by this. And I think this is not really the interesting question, if I could just conclude on this. Recall a few years ago when the Syrians basically swarmed into Europe. At the time, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel had basically urged her European allies, partners, to welcome refugees into Europe. The European Union almost broke apart because of this. When Ukraine went to war in 2022 and millions of Ukrainians or hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians crossed into Western Europe, they were received with open arms. Recall that in Syria in 2013, when Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons in the Ghouta, killing several hundred people, there was a very interesting poll I believe it was the New York Times, that said that a majority of Americans believed that Bashar had used chemical weapons, but only a small number believed that the United States should intervene on behalf of the Syrians. Whereas after October 7th, a majority of Americans believed that the United States must come to the assistance of Israel. All these are signs to a certain extent that I think where the real issue is. What we're seeing is a form of cultural nationalism. It harks back, of course, to the Clash of Civilizations that Samuel Huntington wrote about. But in a way, it's a little bit different in the sense it has the sort of raw side, the acerbic side of nationalism. In other words, there's a sort of cultural nationalism that appears to have taken form in the West, particularly. The notion that people who do not come from what we're familiar with, it can be civilizational, it can be religious, it can be cultural. I mean, all this is a blend of different similar ideas that they are the other. And this, of course, is what is fueling the culture wars in Europe and in the United States. And I think I'll stop here.
Could I just push one step further? The cultural nationalism is something that you see, something that has grown in recent years, going back to Huntington, which is some 30 years ago or so, that this is a particular example is Syrian refugees, problematic, Ukrainian refugees, less problematic simply because of civilization. And is that the narrative there?
Yes, exactly. I think that what has happened, I mean, there have been many things that have fed this mood. There is the fact that the immigration problem in Europe is nowhere close to being resolved. And there has been, of course, in the last decade, a perception in Europe that Islam brings with it threats because of the terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm not saying that I endorse this view, but this is how many Europeans regard it.
Mm-hmm.
So there has been, unfortunately, a perception that everything that is on the other side of the Mediterranean or everything to the east of Europe, in one way or another, poses some kind of threat.
Mm-hmm.
On top of this, politicians in Europe have exploited this. So they've exacerbated the differences.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this also in the United States. So yes, it has increased, I believe, in the last decade, I would say.
Bashar.
I mean, let me start by just maybe laying my cards on the table. I'm a supporter of liberal democracies, Western liberal democracies, and whatever looks like that. You could have that in other. It's not a monopoly of the West, but this model is the model that I find the closest to what one can hope for to live under. So, because of that position, I find myself really quenching when I see the Western apply double standards or show tendencies of the nature that Michael alluded to, and some kind of nationalism of some sort, racism. And when I say the West, I mean, we all know that the West is all places, is not a unified, it's not a one thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not homogeneous. There is an ongoing debate there. There is a right-wing nationalist group, and there is also a centrist liberal democratic group, and there is also a left, which could be we could agree with in many things, but we could also disagree with. So I'm a kind of a centrist liberal democracy person. Now, center is very wide. It could be sometimes considered, left of center, sometimes center, depending on the issue. So saying this about the West, this is the model, and I don't know. I don't think Michael would disagree with me on this point. So how can we make sense that your favorite model misses it sometimes in a very flagrant way? What kind of sense you make out of that, and how do you still defend it as the model? This is the question. Is this a model any longer? Or whatever issue you think that it has diverted from being a model. So, and I want to go back to also what Michael said before, and double standard is not a Western monopoly. It is shared by others. And I would say, in fact, it's shared. It is shared a lot by others. They actually exceed it. If you complain about the attitude of the US in Gaza, for example, then you have to really be more critical of the attitude of Russia in Syria, because Russia did not call for ceasefire or continue giving weapons to the Syrian regime. It actually participated in that war. It started bombing villages and towns and all of that, enabling Assad to do more than what, maybe I don't want to make comparison, but at least something equally horrible. as was happening in Gaza. So you can't say that, and I'm not making comparisons here. I'm not going into analysis of which one is more justified than the other. But at least if we think that what Russia did in Syria is now, you can't say it is horrible. Then you can't say that the Russians are not equally bad in that respect. At least that. Of course, one might say, well, look, Russians are not claiming to be defending human rights. They've never made that kind of thing their discourse. They're not there to liberate people. And that's why we point towards the West when we say about double standards. You have no double standards in Russia because they say it from the beginning, they're into expansion, they're into a zone of influence, they want to flex nationalist muscles. That's the rhetoric of the Kremlin, that's the rhetoric of the nationalists in Russia, those who support the Russian establishment regime with theories and ideas. So in a way, then we can say, well, look, the problem with the West is it claims to be holding those banners and actually conducting its actions in the world under those banners. And that's what makes the kind of double standard accusation stick, or at least more apt in their case. And I think I don't like this. I find myself unhappy with this. First of all, because I don't think that other countries don't claim that they have standards. The Russians say we are fighting terrorists with instability, with favor of stabilizing the region. We are here to, and sometimes they use the same rhetoric as the war on terror rhetoric of the West. So that's one of the main reasons why they interfered in Syria. So it's not that they always do what they say. But even if they do, I see that people who claim to be acting out of moral values, but their actions don't match what they say, are marginally worse, if anything, than those who say we don't care about human rights and they act as they say. I mean, a monster who doesn't say I'm here to help you, I'm here to kill you, is not much better than somebody says I'm here to help you but ends up killing you or wants to kill you. I think the end to have wrong intentions and declare them doesn't really make you better. So, since the double standard accusation doesn't, even if it sticks more on the West, and I don't agree with that, it doesn't help much the others.
But I just wanted to make sure I get whether or not you agree with the moral value point that Bashar raised, and whether or not the point is well taken. I think that is a prerequisite to discuss the issue of double standards anyway.
In World War I and World War II, Europe saw the dangers of nationalism. Nationalism led to two world wars. And in the post-war period, in this effort to reconcile in Europe, they created transnational ideas. The notion of a united Europe. The United States itself has been, again, very contradictory on this. The United States is a country that can be very nationalistic and very destructive in its nationalism. And yet, at the same time, it's a country that has been essentially based throughout its history on the integration of people from around the world. Although we shouldn't forget that at various stages, the US restricted immigration, and on a very racialist basis.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, America remains in the mythology a melting pot. And so we go back to a key idea, I think. Universalist ideals no longer seem to have much of a bearing today. In other words, at the end of the Cold War, if you recall, there was one text that had a great deal of resonance in the United States and in the world. I don't think anyone read it, but they understood the message. It was, of course, Francis Fukuyama's very famous comment how history had ended. In other words, liberal democracy had won. And there was no ideological war anymore that was relevant. At the time, the idea, democracy and liberal democracy, and an extension of liberal democracy, human rights, was seen as a universalist ideal. In other words, if you remember during the 1990s, wars were fought on the basis of humanitarian intervention. We intervened to universalize human rights, whether in Bosnia, whether in Kosovo. Interestingly, no one intervened in Rwanda, no one intervened in Darfur. In other words, it seemed almost that the places where you would intervene were primarily in the West, in the hopefully liberal West. Most of the major ideologies, they have their value in the fact that they can be universally applied. Okay, maybe even if they can't be, but at least when they're presented, they're often presented, whether it's liberal democracy, if you read Locke, or Hobbes is a bit different, it's more pessimistic, whether it's communism, these are not contained to specific societies. Today I see that you don't really have a very strong push for a universalist ideal. If anything, you may still have a little bit a stuttering effort to maintain the European ideal, which is not a universalist ideal, but even there it's being undermined by nationalisms in the countries of Europe.
Michael, may I ask, the European ideal today, is that also diminished as a result of the last 10 years? Do you see European ideals shifting more to a sort of more familiar tone of nationalism that is less welcoming of any refugee, to be frank, whether it's Syrian or Ukrainian or any immigration?
Yes, but primarily refugees who come from what we would call the third world, from cultures that are different than European cultures. I mean, Brexit happened for a reason.
Right.
It was a generational thing. It's primarily older generation Britons who opposed the continuation of this association with Europe because it forced on them to accept the European standards on accepting immigration. Younger people did not go along with this, and this is the hope. But today we're in a moment where I think nationalism has reaffirmed itself, primarily on the immigration question. And to be very fair, because one has to be fair, Europe has not resolved the problem of immigration in a satisfactory way. They just repeat bureaucratically that we must accept, we must be tolerant, without providing any solution. Because quite frankly, I don't think there is a solution. The only solution, to my mind, for immigration is to accept immigrants and to accept that your own societies are going to be fundamentally changed by the arrival of people from the outside. And this is something most Europeans will not accept.
Take the conversation more to action, international action, and double standards in that terrain, because I think
level of states, you mean?
a level of
That's
states,
level of states as well.
yeah. But if with your permission, I'll take it more to two examples. The raw example of what we're seeing every day in Gaza, and it's not full intervention, but there is some intervention in Ukraine. And that story, does the story of universalism, universality and moral value and all that, does it carry any weight today, given that we see absolutely no intervention? And Michael's right, Nikki Haley signing one of those, I think, was it the West Bank or was it in the Galilee? She was
in the northern Israel.
in northern Israel, right? So that kind of, that blatant disregard for anyone on the other end versus the care and caution to at least some minimum of Ukrainian defense capabilities. So that double standard, which is real.
Okay. Now, what you're suggesting, it seems to me that the right thing for the West to do is to actually side with the Palestinians in the same way that sided with the Ukrainians. Not only to ask for a ceasefire. What people are demanding is less than that. It's not that Palestine Hamas. Nobody is going to send javelin rockets to Hamas. If you want to take the comparison fully, they come to the defense of Ukraine. They have to come to the defense of course, as you know, it is a bit much more complicated. It doesn't excuse what the Israelis are doing by to any extent, but the narrative is quite different. At least the narrative accepted in the West is quite different. The narrative in the West is that Israel has been attacked. I'm talking about the narrative, not of those who defend Israel all the way, even those who are critical of Israel.
Okay, I'll let Michael interject since there's a point here.
No, I mean, look, can I say I disagree with this framework. I don't believe
Yeah.
that the intervention on behalf of Ukraine is any more moral than the intervention on the behalf of Israel. They are both immoral. The Americans have basically thrown the Ukraine in a war against Russia for their own reasoning. I'm not talking about the American government. I'm talking about the reaction of publics in Europe, of popular opinion. This is what interests me. It's what is happening in society. Governments are basically evil by nature, by definition. I consider them fundamentally evil. What surprised me is that Ukrainians were accepted. Over 1 million, I think, were accepted and absorbed into Europe. They're still in Western Europe and they're living there without problems. When you had Syrians entering, they basically treated them like animals and they expelled them. And they paid Turkey to keep them, to take them back. Or they've parked them on an island in Greece where they're basically living like, again, with no. So let's distinguish. Bashar is right. We have to distinguish what is the West already. You've got societies, you've got governments. But definitely, I don't see that Ukraine, the way the Americans have supported the Ukrainian government, has anything to do with morality. Basically push them into a war and the Ukrainians are suffering. So that was the only point I wanted to make.
Maybe there's a slight disagreement here. I think I agree with Michael. There are two levels: level of action of the governments and level of action of society, the attitudes of society. What I disagree about is that this kind of total separation between the two. I think in democracies in general, the government, independently of the good intentions of actors within the governments and of the staff, they have to cater for the opinions of the population because this influence elections. So Biden is worried about the impact of his position vis-a-vis Israel because many people, especially young people, are seeing things differently. This is how, or the demonstrations against Vietnam War played a role in pushing the American, not only the people who are dying, but also the fact that people didn't think this is a justified war. And they didn't think it's justified war only because people are dying, but I think people thought it's unjustified because of also the images that's reaching them from Vietnam and the reports about the atrocities the American army is doing there. So if we think that the people carry moral values, some of them carry the wrong values anyway, nationalist desire to revenge and dominate. That also exists. That's part of what people have, each and the individual level as well. But if we think that people are capable of holding moral values and influence and make these values influence what they demand politicians to do, and I agree that's the case. In liberal democracies, there is a chance that this attitude on the public can influence the politicians. So if you carry the right moral values on the popular level, then it will trickle up. Now, it doesn't trickle up automatically. It's not a command that people see this is wrong. Automatically, the establishment and the elite will act on it. But it will put pressure on the elite and the government to act in accordance with it. The more what the people want, the more there is a popular consensus on something, the more difficult it is for the establishment to continue in its course of action. There is this connection between the two. They're not isolated. While in other places where there is no pressure from public opinion, there is no public opinion in China about the treatment of the Muslims in the country. There's no debate. She doesn't really cultivate moral debate about this or about how they behave during the COVID or about any other thing. In this society, the moral pressure from the people on the government is not even allowed to be expressed, even to be cultivated, to become a source of pressure on the state, on the actors as a state. So in a way, I think this is what distinguishes the West in the sense that, and this is why we are worried about Western tendencies of racism and far right, because it is, we believe that there is a connection between the popular opinion and the action. But even if you set that aside, what's the state of popular opinion in the West? I don't think there is one clear one. I think it's shifting. It's shifting also with events. shifts with when October 7 took place, there was more support of Israel at least initially, yeah? Because they felt that this something for them is unacceptable. They were moved by the images, by the fact that this happened, although we might say it didn't start in October 7, but people saw this as a kind of a raid, kind of a pogrom of some sort. By the week, maybe, but it's a pogrom nonetheless. When the Israelis started reacting, they felt that this is going too much, and the people started putting pressure, and the government wanted to continue support, including the US, felt more on the defensive side. They need to defend themselves. This is the result of an active society putting pressure on its governments and the political actors. And I think this is what distinguishes the West from the others.
Let me take that precise point and throw it to you, Michael. The way to hold Western power to account, that trickle up, whether it's protesting or whether it's sheer outrage, that you can hold Western governments to some account and they listen more. Is that how you see what's happening too?
I wish it were like that, but what I'm seeing is something very different. I'm seeing that, yes, to a certain extent, okay, governments, democratic governments do tend to listen more to their population. But I don't think that I'm seeing a lot of this today. What I'm seeing really, at least if I take the United States, is that the United States, as I said, I'm going back to the elite politics. The elites in the United States do not have long considered and long defended the relationship with Israel. And today they were very disturbed by the student protests, the university protests. Why were they disturbed? They were disturbed for a very simple reason. It's that university students are considered the future elite. And yet the future elite in universities were betraying the elites. I mean, these were the people, you would put them in university, they would come out thinking like you. They were going to sustain the system that is in place. And yet these young people were not actually doing that. And so they found many excuses. Either there were many foreigners among them. Now there are people who are proposing expelling the foreigners from the United States. Or they found many excuses to, or they're brainwashed, or they're naive, or whatever. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, in all democracies, in theory, Bashar is right. We always like to think in an ideal way, what is a democracy? And certainly Western societies tend to be more open than others. But still, these are systems that actually are facing major legitimacy problems because societies are no longer believe in them. Now, I know this is taking us a little bit away from the double standards argument, but if I could just sum up the idea, what is the link? The link is the following. It's that when you have societies that are basically dominated by elites, governmental elites, military elites, economic elites, they, in a way, tend to take a very different, over time, they tend to develop an ideology that can be different than the people. And either you have a revolt of the people, which is why we have these populist movements all over Europe and the United States. What they do in the face of this, what do? They either impose their will, or they lose elections. And this is the situation in which we find ourselves today.
So in that example, it's the populations in Europe that are calling for less rather than more of what Bashar is referring to, which is that moral certitude is being diminished by a base rather than from above. Because these elections have taken Europe largely to the right, whether it's Hungary closing its border entirely to Syrians, or this flirtation with France at times with Le Pen and further right, Brexit.
Yeah, but I don't want to go in too much in that direction because I think at the end of we're discussing double standards. I'm trying to say that double standards come because at the end of the day, the elites pursue their interests. They pursue, they pursue what they've always pursued, their interests as an elite.
So the self-interest is at stake more than...
Is at the heart of it.
It's at the heart, yeah.
But at the level of society, you have a different approach. This is why what we're seeing in many Western societies, that fundamental rift taking place in these societies between the political elites who are supporting Israel in Gaza and parts of the society that are saying, no, this is in complete contradiction to our values. This is how I see it. Maybe it's a simplistic view, but this is one of the problems. It's that the West today is the elites have abandoned the so-called universalist approach that democracies should apply.
Yeah.
But their societies, in a way, still believe in these sometimes.
For sure.
There is a kind of double standards in the acquisition of double standards. In 82, we all know about the Sabra and Shatila massacres. It's a well-known thing. It's documented, and it is people read about it, know about it. Sabra and Shatila massacre is, for generations in the West, it's one identifiable item. The Palestinians in Lebanon were subjected to an experience either similar or even worse than the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which is the war of the camps. The Palestinians were attacked, besieged, and starved. And the numbers, as in the case of Sabra and Shatila, vary a lot, but definitely not less than the people killed in Sabra and Shatila. But in the war of the camps, the enemy was not Israel or its proxies here in Lebanon. The enemy was a pro-Syrian regime, sectarian militia, and they were doing the bidding of what the Syrian regime wants and maybe their own aims. But this is not hardly covered in the imagination of the Palestinians themselves. When they write their history in Lebanon, they tend to omit that, maybe out of fear of the Syrian regime, what Syrian regime was controlling, or whatever other reason. It is not presented in the narrative of the Palestinians here. They ignored it altogether. And here we're not talking about ignoring other people being killed. Like I only concern with my own suffering. Actually, they have a double standard depending on who, not the victim is, but who is the victimizer. If the victimizer is Israel, we can immortalize the event, which might be true to immortalize being victim. But when the victimizer is not Syrian, but some other faction, or it's Hamas killing them, or it's the Syrian regime doing something as horrible as the Sabra and Shatila in the camps, we tend to leave it to oblivion. And that is a double standard that we have to face. Another double standard, with all the sympathy that people in the Arab world showed towards the Palestinians. In Lebanon, they live in almost a situation of apartheid. No rights identified, no right to work, no right to travel. They are totally segregated. Of course, no right to nationality, no matter how many centuries they live here. They've been here for 75 years. So if you look at the Palestinian political factions or parties, the one we know about, whether it's the PA, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Jihad, Islamic Jihad, whether it's PLFP, they all, and these are the ones who actually get the support from the population. Hamas is not the minority, or at least it's a big, it takes a big part of the Palestinian Jihad as well, and PLFP and Fatah. All of them are supportive of Assad. For a short phase, Hamas took a distance, but now they thank Assad for his position, and they thank Iran, they thank all of them are close to Assad. Even those who actually don't agree. When Assad, you know what Assad did. Now, if we want to accuse the West of double standards, at least we should look at our even worse and more flagrant double standards. And it's not that we don't know what happened in Syria. It's not that we are far away. It's not that in Texas we hear whatever comes up on social media or on CNN. These are families who know each other, and still there's this perception. And among the Palestinians themselves, they have no capacity to show solidarity to other Palestinians who were killed in Yarmouk camp in Syria, or other Palestinians who killed or to themselves who were killed in the war of camps in the late 80s. So I think this is why, if you listen sometimes to Israeli media, they like to point this out. They like to not necessarily all of these. They say, look, when we kill, everybody goes up in arms. When they kill, it's fine. No Palestinians were like protesting against Assad for at least not significant when they was killing people in Yarmouk camp. And it's not insignificant kind of killing and starvation. So their interpretation of this is anti-Semitism. It's only when the Jew does something wrong. I don't agree with this interpretation. It's not something which is totally imaginary. There is in the same way we interpret the Western double standards as a kind of racism or nationalism, they also interpret the double standards as a kind of anti-Semitism. I disagree with both interpretations, but I think the base of that accusation is not imaginary. There is a deep double standard that we have to face before we start accusing others in our region towards ourselves, not only towards the West. It's not like we treat the Western West and we treat ourselves. We treat ourselves in a double standard manner.
So taking what Bashar said, this narrative which is real, that Palestinian suffering is not just Israel initiated, and you're right. I meet protesters that come to this country that
initiated in Israel, but not continued to be the dominant, did not monopolize victimizing the Palestinians.
So just taking from what you said, the Syrian regime bombing Palestinians in Syria, Nahr al-Barid, for example, here, or Palestinian third class, pure prejudice against the refugee population since 1948. And then measuring that to what Israel does and the outrage that is on display all the time. Would you agree with the way Bashar is saying it, that we have our own double standard that is in a way unique? And I think you're saying in a way that Lebanese
contested
and uncontested, yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, the fact is that victimization unites. So when we portray ourselves as victims in vis-a-vis the West, this is something which unites us. But of course, it's completely true that in the region, if it's the Israelis, we can accuse them. If it's the Syrians, it's more difficult, because immediately by accusing an Arab party of something, you suddenly open up the divisions within Arab societies, and people don't want to do that when they're talking publicly on issues of politics. Double standards have always existed. They've existed in our region. They exist in the West. We all know this. They're in contradiction with universalist principles, which in a way, stand against this. More and more universalist principles are really manipulated by political and economic and defense elites as a way of maintaining systems in place. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but in a way, this is the reality. And therefore, universalist principles, when you contest the elites, you're also contesting, in a way, universalist principles, and you're falling back on a more closed form of nationalism. All these dynamics together only reinforce this double standards. And I think that's the only point I'm trying to make.
Criticism of Hamas, in a way, was very weak and died very quickly in the Arab world, and even among intellectuals abroad. People started seeing this as a kind of way unacceptable. Even before, it became more difficult when the Israeli operation started and it developed the way it developed, and we have the genocide case in the ICJ and all of that. But even before the Israeli reaction, criticizing Hamas was almost a taboo in the Arab world, almost. So, and that in a way, disturbs me. And not a single Arab country was able, even those who are you're thought of to be like in a way on the other side, they're anti-Hamas, anti-Saudi Arabia, for example, did not condemn Hamas. Even in the beginning, the PA, they later wrote something about criticizing Hamas for their adventurism and all of that, but they did not immediately. In fact, immediate condemnation of Hamas action would have been more apt than the later one after what the Israelis did, because then something else comes and in a way might in a way, make what Hamas did not as significant. Still condemnable, in my opinion, but at least one can understand. But at the eve of that thing, the criticism of that action was so weak, to the extent that I would understand when the Israelis say, look how weak the condemnation of Hamas, even on October 8th. It's not about what we have done to them. It's about that they are happy doing this to us, and if we don't have the power to prevent it, it will be October 7th every day. This is the perception, and I think the perception is used and abused to justify what they're doing, but it's not a totally baseless thing. I'm a professor at the UB, and I was not able. I felt the pressure that I was invited to a panel that was earlier on, but it not much into the war. And I felt that if I'm going to say that, I'm going to say that because of Hamas, I would be attacked. So I decided to do the following. I decided to read what Judith Butler wrote in London Review of Books, or that in New York Books, I don't know. She wrote in the beginning and criticism of Hamas. This is brutality. This is terror. All of that stuff. Of course, she also criticized Israel. She would not, but at least she did. Then Judith Butler retreated and said, "I apologize," but said, "This is a resistance. I withdraw my criticism of Hamas on October 7th." Now, this is the atmosphere. This is the dominant atmosphere here. So I felt that criticizing Hamas for what they did on October 7th is important if we want to conduct a struggle against the state of Israel in order to achieve Palestinian rights. Anything other than that will lead to the abyss, in my opinion. If we don't face that criticism, yet at the same time show all the support for the Palestinian people in Gaza, then you will not be able to actually advance that kind of cause.
Do you see it the same way, Michael?
Yeah, no, on this I have to agree with Bashar. I think, unfortunately, we have always, in the Arab world, no voice louder than the voice of battle. When you're in the midst of a battle, you have to remain in solidarity. But for me, the big question here is what has justified the wholesale destruction of Gaza? In other words, Hamas, I haven't heard since October 7th one full sentence by the leadership of Hamas on what the political objectives of October 7th were. We guess, we can suppose, I've heard many suppositions, many theories of what they did. But the fact of the matter is that none of them absolutely convinced me. What bothers me is that, in fact, there has been no one demanding what is the political objective here. What we've seen is partisans saying we're for or we're against. But in the end, what may have happened on October 7th may be something completely indefensible, namely a power play by Yahya Sinwar in Gaza and Mohammed Deif against the Hamas leadership outside. Did this justify this whole-scale slaughter for the last 8 months by Israel? In other words, we cannot say honestly that there is no responsibility by Hamas for what happened, although we can completely agree on the criminality of Israel and of the entire Israeli leadership. And the fact even I'm willing to entertain that what is taking place is a genocide. But there is some kind of question that has to be posed. What was Hamas's objective? And until we ask a question like that, I think Bashar is right. It's not a satisfactory analysis of the situation until we get an answer to that question.
So this does open the door to the question of double standards and criticism. We're able to criticize Israel day in, day out. You're not able to criticize Hamas, especially in times of battle.
Well,
and you said it earlier that even pre-October 7, there's little to no criticism, period. So is that I sense there's more agreement than disagreement here.
Better describe it's not as a double standard, but as because it's not like they say we should criticize Hamas, but they don't do it. They actually say we should not criticize Hamas. Hamas becomes uncriticizable, and that's not a level. That's a standard. It's a bad standard, but it is not a double standard. Of course, it's a double standard in the sense that they are willing to criticize other actors. You know, they if
But Bashar, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
You're right, but the fact of the matter is no one is in the midst of battle willing to break solidarity. And the criticism will come, I believe, once this is over. It will come. And
unlike in the case of Israel, where although they're in the middle of battle, there are a lot of criticism in the society. There's demonstrations that pro-freeing the hostage was an agreement. Many people are saying this war is not going well. You have articles in not only in Haaretz but also in Times of Israel and in Ahronot and Ma'arif that criticize the conduct of the war, that we are not achieving victory. There's what people in the establishment themselves come out like Gantz and say, this is crazy. We need to have a day after, otherwise this war goes nowhere. There is, and they are in the war still, and they are in a very, very difficult war, given how badly they're doing in the public.
But they continue to support this massive destruction.
But at least there's a debate. You might say, look.
But there is a debate that's true, but it's not changing the fundamental fact that there is a vast majority who are willing to annihilate Gaza.
Yes,
and get rid of the population of Gaza. I mean, we have to understand that you're right. There is a debate, but this began on October 8th as an Israeli intention to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and that's what they're doing today. What we're seeing is a process of ethnic cleansing. And how they cannot get rid of the population yet, but they can destroy Gaza that the population will slowly but surely leave Gaza.
No, I'm not disputing that or debating it. I'm saying that.
But I'm saying the debate in Israel nonetheless allows this to happen.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that a debate about Hamas will make Hamas change its course of action. But at least one cannot say that in times of war, lack of debate is justifiable and understandable. I think it's not justifiable, and it doesn't help those who are fighting that war. It doesn't help them that there's no debate. It's not like it's a necessity of war. It's a solidarity of some sort, but that solidarity is not beneficial to the fighting force. This is my opinion.
I agree, but the vast majority of the public disagrees with
Yes, of course.
This is why I'm saying we're not seeing criticism.
This is why also in Israel, that those on the right don't want to size. There's a debate now. Should we conduct an audit of the Israeli behavior that led to October 7th? And some people don't want this to go on because they think this is divisive in the middle of the war. And some people say, no, we have to go and probe our failures even while fighting the war. So that kind of debate, I think we don't have something like that.
Sorry for this naive interjection, but the fact that you're pointing more at the health of the Israeli political establishment, I think that you can debate in times of war there about everything, including Israeli policy too. On the other side, including here, there's little to no, there's marginal debate. Is that pointing back to the moral value issue that you can hold Israel to account more than Assad or more than any other regime? And I'll give you another example: the protests in Jordan that come and go but are largely silent. That regime cannot be held to account too. Is that the weight you were referring to at the beginning? That this is a regime that can still be held to some account compared to the rest?
Well, I mean, it holds at least an account to itself, in a sense that what if Michael is right? What is the political program? A political program that actually advances Palestinian rights. That's the political program. It can't be a program advancing Iranian influence in the region. It must be a program that advances Palestinian rights. You cannot ask the question, at least in the case of Israel, you can ask the question, what are the aims of the war? Are we achieving it? Should we have election? Because those who are leading us now are those who are responsible for the failure, and for we don't trust them in continuing the war. That kind of debate, is not here.
If we cut away the meat, I think on both sides we see very, very base motives. I think that Hamas's attack of October 7th was an internal power, part of an internal struggle for power, for control of Hamas, in the context of what is called the unity of the arena strategy that the Iranians put. That's on the Hamas. On the Israeli side, Netanyahu is not there to defend Israel. He's there to survive politically. He knows very well that he is responsible for allowing October 7th, for having basically divided the country on this constitutional amendment. And he had received many warnings from the military. He ignored them. And this is the fact. On both sides have something to hide, very simply.
And I think there's something because of Hamas and to others, but let's focus on Hamas. Is that they have simply separated their success from achieving Palestinian aims. What other Palestinian aim is to have a state, or whatever the aim is, to maybe take the whole of Palestine back, but at least something like that. There must be the aim that Hamas is. There is no connection between their success and achieving those aims. Their success is to survive at the end of the Gaza war. And if they don't survive, they will survive somewhere else, and they will say, we couldn't eliminate us.
There is a second factor.
But why? Once you separate your success from achieving your aims, you are victorious all the time. Because unless they kill every single person, you will survive. So they managed to ensure victory before the war ends. And the only victory is to kill everybody, and that requires something which is more unjustifiable and difficult to do, physically difficult to do. So they ensure their success by separating their criteria of success from achieving Palestinian, and this link Palestinian aims. This links with Michael's. What is the aim of Hamas? As if Hamas is not responsible for achieving those aims. It's responsible for doing something against the Israelis, but not for that thing becoming part of a plan to achieve aims.
What was the second point?
The second point, very simply, is that what we're seeing today, we're moving into a period of transition in Palestinian politics. Mahmoud Abbas is going to leave the scene in the coming year, 2 years. I don't know. He's let's say he has more time behind him than ahead of him, and it's a struggle for that ultimately. I think that Hamas really has done two things. I think within Hamas there is a struggle for leadership between Sinwar and the leadership in exile. But I also think that Hamas itself, more broadly, sees an opportunity to finally take a leading role in the resistance against Israel, because Fatah has been so discredited. And this is what we're seeing, these dynamics. And this is why sooner or later Hamas has to come to a very simple conclusion. They cannot take over the Palestinian cause if they do not have a political objective. If the objective is simply, as in the past, revolution until victory, Thawra Hatt al-Nasr, this is not going to be enough, I think, to take the Palestinians in the direction of independence.
So I appreciate this is almost like a calculated political move for domestic terrain and domestic gains that turned into a huge fiasco. I think that's kind of what you're alluding to.
Yeah, but maybe also a major victory. In other words,
for Hamas.
I mean, a victory, Hamas on the blood of 40,000 Palestinians, but a victory in the sense they fought the epic battle. They fought the epic battle, and they may survive the epic battle.
The damage Hamas did, October 7th, is that had made, if the chance of a two-state solution was zero, -40 now, in my opinion. And that's something maybe we need to
-40? So
if it was zero, there's no chance.
It's even less than before.
It's -40.
-40.
Yeah.
But you're right, Bashar. But that may be precisely what they want. They want
exactly.
two-state solution.
Exactly. And the one-state solution was already -40 before that. I mean, this is the one-state solution is not on the card. That's we can discuss that some other time.
But can I play devil's advocate?
Yeah.
What they've done is essentially taken Israel and pushed Israel in front of its contradictions.
Yes.
If Israel doesn't want a two-state solution and doesn't want a one-state solution, what does Israel want? Open-ended repression of 7.2 million Palestinians.
I agree with you.
And in a way,
But-
what they've done, maybe without realizing it, or is that simply they've created for the first time a very strong, a convincing argument in the West that Israel doesn't want a solution.
Mm.
They've put this on the table, and this is a victory.
To be frank, I'm perplexed about this myself. I don't have a strong view. History, future will tell whether this is going to change. Israel is showing it the contradiction that Michael is showing.
Hmm.
In the current moment, the rejection of Israel has never been more endorsed within Israel than before. Maybe this is a momentary shock. Maybe
Sorry, what do you mean the rejection of Israel?
that the people who reject the Palestinian state, in Israel has never been lower than before. Every politician comes to us, we are not going to accept Palestinian state. So at the moment, if you take the parameter now, if you take the temperature now, it's very low. Now, maybe this is temporary. Maybe later they will realize that
This is precisely what Hamas wants.
and this is what I think is not good for the Palestinians. Unless you are right that eventually the Israelis will realize that they have reached an impasse. They have to make a U-turn.
No, but you see, I would go, and then I'll stop here from my end. But basically, Hamas sees that now in alliance with their other partners in this unity of the strategy, yani Iran and Hezbollah and their allies in Iraq and in Syria and wherever, that finally this is now the time to go for a military option and win a victory.
And I think,
Even if it doesn't work, they're in the driver's seat.
The other option is a defeat Israel militarily. Don't need to ask them for one state or two states. You impose one, as this, and that I think is more far-fetched.
Michael, I've heard you say it before that there should be no expectation for any positive U.S. engagement in the Middle East anytime soon. I hope I'm paraphrasing that correctly. And Bashar, I've heard you say it in a different way.
On the Palestinian issue,
On the Palestinian issue, sorry. And Bashar, I've heard you say that it still counts. Western influence in the region still holds some weight in a positive way, not in a destructive way.
But could I just clarify one thing?
Yeah.
I mean, today the Americans can come and make momentary arrangements between Palestinians and Israelis. This is not what I'm talking about. In terms of the end goal of creating a Palestinian state, this is where I believe the United States has the only value added is that the Israelis will listen to them, but they will always side with the Israelis against the Palestinians. They will never be an honest broker.
Settlement to happen, or at least for the beginning of settlement to happen, the U.S. should confront two sides, and confronting one without the other will not pushing back as two sides. One is confrontation, one is pushback. One is the far right and the right camp in Israel. They don't want to remove settlements and never will give a Palestinian state. And then Iran. If you do one without the other, Iran will spoil whatever offer the Israelis. And if you don't push back on the right wing in Israel, they will not give you an offer at all. So unless you want to protect the settlement and protect it from both ends, the far right killed Rabin and undermined, and Hamas did the suicide bombs after the killing of Rabin to ensure that, at least intentionally, not intentionally, that Netanyahu would win the elections after Rabin. Those two actors, unless simultaneous US shows confronts them. So far, it has failed, Obama and with Biden, to confront. And with Trump, nothing works because the guy has no credibility. Does what he does and the values he presents are not what we want the West to be presenting. So, sensible president of the US, part of an establishment, have failed to make those confrontations.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the first episode of Point Counterpoint, give us a like on our YouTube channel, subscribe, leave a comment, and if you're listening, engage us on your preferred podcast platform and follow us across social media. It's at the Beirut Banyan on X, Instagram, and Facebook. We'll be back soon for episode 2, but in the meantime, enjoy other episodes for the Beirut Banyan podcast. Take care.